The wind howled across the barren Wyoming plains, carrying with it the sharp bite of an early autumn chill. In the dead of night, under a moonless sky, a faint splash broke the silence of the Lazy Creek Ranch, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for a fish breaking the surface of the creek. But Amos Tully, a weathered rancher with hands calloused from decades of toil, knew better. His heart lurched as he stood frozen on the porch of his modest cabin, his lantern casting a trembling glow across the darkness. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The creek, which ran like a lifeline through his sprawling property, had been his sanctuary for years, a place of quiet reflection after long days herding cattle. But tonight, it whispered a secret that made his blood run cold. He'd heard the rumors, the hushed tales swapped over whiskey at the local saloon about strange happenings in these parts, disappearances, shadows moving in the night, and cries that seemed to come from nowhere. Amos had dismissed them as ghost stories spun by bored cowhands, but now, as he strained his ears, he heard it again, a muffled sob, desperate and human, rising from the water's edge. His boots crunched against the frost-dusted earth as he moved toward the sound, his lantern swaying, each step heavier than the last. What he would find in the creek would change his life forever, unraveling a nightmare that would test the limits of his courage, his compassion, and his faith in humanity. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of standing up for what's right, please hit that like button, drop a comment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support keeps these stories alive, and together, we can spread a little more light in the world. Amos was no stranger to hardship. At 57, his face was a map of wrinkles carved by years of sun and sorrow. He'd lost his wife, Clara, to fever a decade ago, and their only son, Jacob, to a reckless dream of gold in California's hills. The ranch was all he had left, a sprawling 800 acres of stubborn earth that he worked alone, save for a few hired hands who came and went with the seasons. The creek was his solace, its gentle current a reminder of softer days when Clara would sit with him on its banks, her laughter mingling with the water's song. But tonight, the creek was no place of peace. As Amos approached, the sobbing grew clearer, laced with a terror that made his chest tighten. He raised his lantern, its light cutting through the darkness to reveal a sight that stopped him dead. There, half submerged in the shallow, icy water, was a girl, no more than 16 or 17, her dark hair plastered to her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. She was clutching a jagged rock, her knuckles white, her body trembling as she pressed herself against the bank as if trying to vanish into the earth. Her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear at first, but as Amos stepped closer, he caught them. "Don't let him find me, please." The desperation in her voice was a knife to his heart, stirring memories of his own son's pleading eyes before he'd left home, never to return. Amos's first instinct was to rush to her, to pull her from the freezing water, but caution held him back. The girl's fear was not of the cold or the dark, it was of something, or someone, else. He scanned the shadows beyond the creek, his ears straining for any sound beyond the wind and the water. The ranch was remote, miles from the nearest town of Redstone, and visitors were rare, especially at this hour. Who could she be running from? Bandits were not uncommon in these parts, but the girl's terror suggested something more personal, more sinister. Amos set his lantern down and crouched. Low, his voice soft but steady. He didn't know her name, her story, or why she was here, but he knew one thing: he couldn't leave her. He waded into the creek, the cold biting through his boots, and extended a hand. She flinched at first, her eyes darting past him as if expecting a monster to emerge from the darkness, but slowly, she reached for him. Her hand was small and fragile in his, and as he pulled her from the water, he saw the bruises, dark, angry marks on her arms and neck, barely hidden by her torn dress. Whoever she was running from had already left their mark. The girl's name, he learned later that night as he wrapped her in a blanket by his fireplace, was Lila. Her story came in fragments, each word trembling with the weight of what she'd endured. She was an orphan, raised by a distant aunt in Redstone until a man named Harlan Voss had come into their lives. Voss was a drifter, a charming snake oil salesman with a smile that hid a cruel streak. He'd promised Lila's aunt wealth and security, but his true interest was Lila. When her aunt died suddenly, too suddenly, Lila suspected, Voss had claimed guardianship, and his charm had turned to control. He kept her locked in a boarding house, forcing her to work for him, his temper flaring at the slightest defiance. 2 nights ago, she'd fled, stealing a horse and riding until it collapsed from exhaustion. She'd stumbled onto Amos's ranch by chance, hiding in the creek when she heard hoofbeats in the distance, certain Voss was closing in. Amos listened, his jaw tightening with each detail. He'd known men like Voss, men who preyed on the vulnerable, who twisted trust into a weapon. But what could he do? He was just one man, old and tired, with no kin to call on and a town too far to reach before dawn. The night stretched on, and Amos sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, watching the windows for any sign of movement. Lila slept fitfully on the cot he'd set up, her breaths uneven, her hands clutching the blanket as if it were a shield. Amos's mind raced. He could take her to Redstone, to the sheriff, but Voss was clever. Lila said he had a way of twisting the truth, of making people believe his lies. And what if Voss was already out there, watching, waiting? The ranch was isolated, its fences and barns offering little protection against a determined man. Amos thought of Clara, of how she'd always urged him to do what was right, no matter the cost. But doing right now meant putting himself, and Lila, in danger. He could turn her away, tell her to move on, keep his own life simple. But one look at her, curled up and shivering even in sleep, told him that wasn't an option. He'd lost too much to lose already, he wouldn't let it claim another soul. By morning, Amos had a plan, rough as it was. He'd take Lila to Redstone himself, but not before ensuring she was safe. He fortified the cabin, barring the windows and setting traps along the paths leading to the creek. He gave Lila his old hunting knife, showing her how to hold it, though her hands shook too much to wield it with confidence. The day passed in tense quiet, with Amos working the ranch as best he could while keeping an eye on the horizon. Lila stayed inside, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. As dusk fell, the air grew heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Amos was checking the horses in the barn when he heard it, a low whistle, sharp and deliberate, from the direction of the creek. His heart sank. Voss was here. The next hours were a blur of fear and instinct. Amos slipped back to the cabin, waking Lila and urging her to hide in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. She begged him not to face Voss alone, but Amos knew there was no choice. He was no hero, no gunslinger from the dime novels, but he was stubborn, and he'd be damned if he let a man like Voss take another piece of innocence from the world. He took his rifle and positioned himself by the front window, peering into the growing dark. The whistle came again, closer now, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. Voss wasn't hiding, he wanted Amos to know he was coming. The rancher's heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He thought of Jacob, of the boy he'd failed to protect, and vowed that this time, he'd stand his ground. Voss appeared at the edge of the lantern's light, a tall figure in a long coat, his hat tilted low. He carried no weapon that Amos could see, but his presence was a threat all its own. He called out, his voice smooth and taunting, claiming Lila was his ward, stolen away by her own foolishness. He spoke of gratitude, of rewards for her return, but Amos heard the lie beneath the words. He shouted back, warning Voss to leave, but the man only laughed, stepping closer. The standoff stretched on, each moment heavier than the last, until a gunshot cracked through the night, not from Amos but from the shadows near the barn. One of Amos's hired hands, a young drifter named Eli who'd stayed on longer than most, had been watching from a distance. Eli's shot missed, but it was enough to spook Voss, who vanished into the darkness as quickly as he'd come. Amos didn't sleep that night, nor did Lila. They sat together, her fear slowly giving way to a fragile trust. Eli, shaken but resolute, agreed to ride with them to Redstone at first light. The journey was long and tense, the three of them scanning the horizon for any sign of Voss. In town, the sheriff listened to Lila's story, his face hardening as she spoke. He knew of Voss, had heard whispers of his dealings, but lacked proof until now. Lila's testimony, backed by Amos's account and the bruises she bore, was enough to start a manhunt. Voss was gone by the time the posse searched the boarding house, but the town rallied around Lila, offering her a place to stay with a kind widow who ran the general store. Amos returned to his ranch, his heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. He'd done something good, something Clara would have been proud of. The creek, once a place of solace, now held a new meaning, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. Lila visited the ranch often in the months that followed, bringing with her a spark of life Amos hadn't realized he'd missed. She helped with small chores, her laughter filling the empty spaces of the cabin. Eli stayed on, too, finding a home in the work and in Amos's quiet mentorship. The ranch became a haven, not just for Amos but for those who needed it, a place where second chances were built on sweat and stubborn hope. Voss was never caught, but his shadow faded, replaced by the strength Lila found in her new life. Amos, too, found healing, his grief for Clara and Jacob softening into a quiet pride. The creek still flowed, its waters carrying away the nightmares of the past, whispering of redemption and the power of standing up for what was right. This story is for anyone who's ever felt lost, afraid, or alone, and for those who've stood up to protect them. If Lila and Amos's journey touched your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support means the world, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter. Before we go, please drop a comment below and let us know, what would you have done in Amos's shoes? Or share a moment when someone's kindness changed your life. We read every comment, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.